Good evening. Welcome to this evening's lecture on famous shipwrecks. Tonight's speaker, we have reference librarian Jill Sollazzo, who put together this fantastic presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Famous Shipwrecks. Like Steve said, my name is Jill Sollazzo, and I'm one of the reference librarians here at East Hampton Library. I just want to give a quick background about me and why I chose this subject. I actually have a degree in anthropology and archaeology, as well as a degree in library science, and I've always been fascinated by shipwrecks and the history behind them. And I am by no means an expert on shipwrecks or boats at all in any way, but I've chosen a selection of shipwrecks that I think everybody will find very interesting. So archaeology, simply defined, is the science of learning about past human behavior by examining the physical remains left behind by people of the past. Archaeological remains, including sites, structures, features, and artifacts, provide tangible links to our collective human history and our glimpses into the social, economic, and cultural evolution of our species. Archaeology, at its core, is about discovery. We discover how people in the past lived, how they adapted to their environment, how they utilized natural resources, how they changed the world around them. When a new cemetery is established on dry land, the grounds are thoughtfully curated. But when a ship is lost without warning, there's no time for such plans. As the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, website observes, accidental shipwrecks show the past as it really was by preserving a single moment in time. Sunken vessels captivate us. They inspire grief, wonder, romance, and horror. The Underwater Cultural Heritage Division of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, notes, it can be estimated that over 3 million wrecks are spread across ocean floors around the planet. While this is, of course, only an estimate, and while the preservation of their remains depends much on the environment, some of these wrecks are thousands of years old. So we're going to show you some examples of famous ships, some you might not have heard of, that went under, leaving a changed world in their wakes. So first, if you're not a seasoned boater or traveler of the high seas, I am not, then I hope you'll find this simple graphic helpful. So it refers to the sides of the boat, port, bow, starboard, and stern. I will be referring to these in my explanations of the shipwrecks on more than one occasion, so just keep this in mind as we move forward. And then just something else to keep in mind, ship prefixes. A ship prefix is a combination of letters, usually abbreviations, used in front of the name of a civilian or naval ship that has historically served numerous purposes, such as identifying the vessel's mode of propulsion, purpose, or ownership and nationality. The list can be long, so for the purposes of our program today, these are the definitions of the prefixes of the ships on the list. And as always, if you have any questions or want a full list, you can certainly ask your reference desk and reference librarians at your library if you're interested in learning. And so without further ado, let's begin. Now, no list is complete without the Titanic, and I certainly wasn't going to leave it off the list. I'm sure a lot of people fascinated with shipwrecks can count this ship as one of the reasons why. The Rms Titanic is undoubtedly the most famous shipwreck in history. It was built in Ireland as part of the White Star Line's new Olympic class of vessels, which were designed to compete with the Cunard ships Lusitania and Mauritania, which were the fastest passenger ships then in service. The Titanic was, at the time of its construction, the largest ocean liner in the world and was famously said to be unsinkable. The boat consisted of 10 decks, of which 8 were for passenger use. Interiors of the Olympic-class ships were subdivided into 16 primary compartments divided by 15 bulkheads that extended above the waterline. 11 vertically closing watertight doors could seal off the compartments in the event of an emergency. This would have been found on the lower decks, where storage and the boilers and engine rooms were located. Titanic's radio telegraph equipment was leased to the White Star Line by the Marconi International Marine Communication Company, which also supplied two of its employees, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, as operators. The service maintained a 24-hour schedule, primarily sending and receiving passenger telegrams, but also handling navigation messages, including weather reports and ice warnings, which, as we know, is very important. The passenger facilities aboard Titanic aimed to meet the highest standards of luxury. And basically, the middle image and the bottom left are going to be first class. The middle image on the bottom is second class, and then the bottom right is going to be a third class cabin. According to Titanic's general arrangement plans, the ship could accommodate 833 first-class passengers, 614 in second class, and 1,006 in third class, for a total passenger capacity of 2,000. In addition, her capacity for crew members exceeded 900. Among the more novel features available to the first-class passengers was a 7-foot deep saltwater swimming pool, a gymnasium, a squash court, and a Turkish bath, which comprised an electric bath, steam room, massage room, and hot room. One of Titanic's most distinctive features was her first-class staircase, pictured in the bottom left, known as the Grand Staircase or Grand Stairway. Built of solid English oak with a sweeping curve, the staircase descended through 7 decks of the ship. And of course, anyone who has seen the film Titanic would remember this staircase. The Grand Staircase was actually destroyed during the sinking and is now just a void in the ship, which modern explorers have used to access the lower decks. Third class, commonly referred to as steerage accommodations aboard Titanic, were not as luxurious as first or second class, but even so were better than or on many other ships at the time. While other ships provided only open berth sleeping arrangements, the White Star Line vessels actually provided their third-class passengers with private, small, but comfortable cabins capable of accommodating 2 to up to 10 passengers. White Star Line decided that only 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsibles would be carried, which could accommodate 1,178 people, 1/3 of Titanic's total capacity. And that sounds ridiculously low, but at the time, the Board of Trade's regulations required British vessels over 10,000 tons to only carry 16 lifeboats with a capacity of 990 occupants. Therefore, at 20 boats, the White Star Line actually provided more lifeboat accommodation than was legally required. At the time, lifeboats were intended to ferry survivors from a sinking ship to a rescuing ship, not keep afloat the whole population or power them to shore. The maiden voyage of Titanic was intended to be a first of many travels between Southampton, England, and New York. Captained by Edward John Smith, Titanic left the dock in Southampton on April 10th, making stops before beginning its trek across the Atlantic. The plan was for Titanic to arrive in New York on April 17th. The exact number of people aboard is not known, as not all of those who had booked tickets made it to the ship. About 50 people canceled for various reasons, and not all of those who boarded stayed aboard for the entire journey. It is estimated that there were approximately 2,224 passengers and crew aboard at the time of the sinking. As it was the maiden voyage of such a prominent ship, there was a number of notable people on board, including John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, painter and sculptor Francis Davis Millay, Macy's owner Isidore Straus and his wife Ida, and again, in the film Titanic, they're famously pictured as the older couple who are laying in their bed together as the water rises. When in fact, Ida refused to get into a lifeboat, knowing that Isidore could not come with her, and Isidore refused to make an exception to allow himself space on a boat. Ida gave her fur coat to her maid, and the couple were last spotted on the ship arm in arm on the deck. Denver millionairess Margaret Molly Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, because she helped in the ship's evacuation, taking an oar in her lifeboat and urging that the lifeboat go back and save more passengers, even telling the quartermaster she would throw him overboard if he didn't turn around. Sources vary on whether the boat actually did turn around, but after rescue, Molly organized survivors to help with recovery and resources. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Lady Duff Gordon, were also aboard. Lucy Noel Leslie, the Countess of Roths, who was actually another woman who took control of her lifeboat to help others, and many more. The ship's owner, J.P. Morgan, was scheduled to be on the maiden voyage, but canceled at the last minute. There were a number of notable people who missed their voyage on the Titanic besides J.P. Morgan. They included Milton Hershey, Guglielmo Marconi, Henry Frick, and Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt. There are to date around 118,000 people who claim to have just missed the boat. So Titanic received a series of warnings from other ships of drifting ice in the area of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, but Captain Edward Smith chose to ignore them. Nevertheless, the ship continued to steam at full speed, which was actually standard practice at the time. It was generally believed that ice posed little danger to large vessels. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg immediately ahead of Titanic and alerted the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to be steered around the obstacle and the engines to be reversed, but it was too late. The starboard side of Titanic struck the iceberg, creating a series of holes below the waterline. The hull wasn't punctured by the iceberg, but rather dented such that the hull's seams buckled and separated, allowing water to rush in. 5 of the ship's watertight compartments were breached. The crew of the Titanic had not been trained adequately in carrying out an evacuation. The officers did not know how many they could safely put aboard the lifeboats and launched many of them barely half full. Third-class passengers were largely left to fend for themselves, causing many of them to become trapped below decks as the ship filled with water. Between 2:10 and 2:15 a.m., a little over 2.5 hours after Titanic struck the iceberg, her rate of sinking suddenly increased as the boat deck dipped underwater and the sea poured in through open hatches and grates. With the bow underwater and air trapped in the stern remained afloat and buoyant for a few minutes longer, rising to a nearly vertical angle with hundreds of people still clinging to it, before foundering at 2:20 in the morning. Almost all of the people in the water died of cardiac arrest or other bodily reactions to freezing water within 15 to 30 minutes. Only 5 were helped into the lifeboats, though the lifeboats had room for almost 500 more people. Controversy surrounds the rescue and recovery efforts because of the role played by SS Californian, which had been only a few miles from Titanic but had not picked up her distress calls or responded to her signal rockets. Californian had warned Titanic by radio of the pack ice, and that was actually the reason the Californian had stopped for the night, but was rebuked by Titanic's senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips. RMS Carpathia arrived around 4 a.m. and picked up the approximately 710 survivors. Around 1,500 people lost their lives in the disaster. The last remaining survivor, Melvina Dean, was only 9 weeks old at the time of the sinking, passed away in 2009 at age 97. So in 1985, an expedition led by Robert Ballard was successful in locating the wreckage of the Titanic in roughly 12,600 feet of water. Boat split upon sinking, with the bow being more intact than the stern, so the bow is up top, the stern below it. The ship's condition has deteriorated significantly over the years, particularly from accidental damage by submersibles, but mostly because of an accelerating rate of growth of iron-eating bacteria on the hull. In 2006, it was estimated that within 50 years, the hull and structure of Titanic would eventually collapse entirely, leaving only the more durable interior fittings of the ship intermingled with a pile of rust on the seafloor. Many artifacts have been recovered from the wreckage and are displayed all over the world. So I'll just point out, the top center picture is actually the grand staircase. That's as it looks today. So it's a giant hole, and you can actually see a submersible in the middle of the picture. The dead center picture is actually the captain's quarters, and you can clearly see that white is the bathtub. And the bottom right is a current picture of the captain's quarters, and the red circle is actually circled around that same bathtub. So as you can see, in not a lot of time, a lot of deterioration has occurred because that room has changed significantly. The bottom center picture is actually an image of the stained glass windows in the Turkish bath. So many artifacts have recovered from the wreckage, displayed all over the world. It's estimated that approximately $6 million worth of belongings went down with the ship. And you can see in the top right corner, that's actually where the ship was located in. I just wanted to show you real quick a comparison between the size of the Titanic and the size of a current cruise ship. So as you can see, while the Titanic at the time was considered one of the largest and most luxurious ships, it's far eclipsed by today's ships in terms of size. So real quick, I just wanted to point out this interesting fact about this book. Futility was an 1898 novella written by author Morgan Robertson. It was republished in 1912 after the sinking as The Wreck of the Titan. The Futility book features a fictional British ocean liner named the Titan that sinks in the North Atlantic after striking an iceberg. Like the Titanic, the fictional ship sank in April in the North Atlantic, and there were not enough lifeboats for all of the passengers. There are also similarities in size, speed, and life-saving equipment. After the sinking, some people credited Robertson with precognition and clairvoyance, which he denied. Scholars attribute the similarities to his extensive knowledge of shipbuilding and maritime trends. And lastly, the question I'm sure everyone is wondering, could Rose and Jack have fit on the door together? This is something that comes up all the time. It's still debated to this day. The short answer is actually yes, they could have. So the show Mythbusters in the bottom right corner aimed to prove if this could happen and determined that if they had taken off Rose's life vest and used it as a floating device under the door, that the door would have stayed afloat with both Rose and Jack on it. The story would have been much different. So we could do a whole program on this ship alone, but we have a lot more interesting wrecks to cover, so I'm going to continue. So next up is the Endurance. Endurance was built in Norway under the direction of master wood shipbuilder Christian Jacobsen, who made sure that every detail of her construction had been scrupulously planned to ensure maximum durability. For example, every joint and fitting was cross-braced for maximum strength. She was a three-masted ship designed for polar waters and launched in 1912. Explorer Ernest Shackleton purchased the boat in 1914 from Polaris to Endurance after the Shackleton family motto, which is "By endurance we conquer." To find crew for the Endurance, Shackleton reportedly placed an advertisement in the Times reading, quote, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. December of 1914, Endurance left its last port of call, heading for the southern regions of the Weddell Sea in the Antarctic Circle. By January 24th, the wind had completely compressed the ice in the Weddell Sea against the land, leaving Endurance icebound as far as the eye could see in every direction. Worked to make channels in the pack ice, allowing the ship to move forward in small increments. By October of 1915, the ship broke free from pack ice, only to be re-encased a few days later and causing the ship to list almost 30 degrees port side. After unsuccessfully trying to save the ship, Shackleton ordered all to abandon on October 27th. In April of 1916, they set off in the Endurance's 3 ship's boats and eventually landed on Elephant Island, a remote island off of Antarctica. Several of the crew, including the boat's captain and Shackleton himself, set out on a voyage to gather a rescue boat. August, 128 days after the 5-member team left for help, the remaining 22 crew members were rescued. So, in March of 2022, yes, this year, the Endurance 22 expedition announced that they had discovered the wreck of Endurance in the Weddell Sea at a depth of almost 10,000 feet. The wreck is in remarkably good condition, with the name Endurance on the stern clearly legible. In line with the team's promise, they did not salvage any part of the wreck or its contents, as the ship is actually now a protected historic site and monument under the Antarctic Treaty System. So next on our list is actually a 2-for-1 deal and an expedition gone wrong on the opposite side of the Earth from the Endurance. The HMS Terror was built in June of 1813 as a bomb vessel with an extremely strong hull. It was involved in several battles of the War of 1812 against the U.S., and the HMS Airbus was built as a warship by the Royal Navy in 1826. Retired from naval service, both ships became exploration ships. They were both outfitted with additional strengthening and an internal heating system. They were outfitted with 20 feet of iron sheeting along the sides from the bows, as well as steam engines and propellers. Both ships made several successful trips to the Antarctic, but it was a trip to explore the Northwest Passage that would be their demise. Both ships set sail in 1845 under Sir John Franklin and were last spotted by the whaling ship Enterprise in July 1845, secured to an iceberg. The last definite information known is that the ships were abandoned completely on April 2nd, 1848, from a message left by the 2 ships' captains. And both ships were lost, and all 129 men on board perished. Dozens of expeditions were led to locate the missing crew and the ships themselves. Over the years, many items were discovered that belonged to the boats and their crew. A total of 39 missions, most at the behest of Franklin's widow, were sent to the Arctic to locate the boats and their crews, but it wasn't until the 1850s that evidence of what befell the men began to emerge. Search parties began to locate more and more items and even found unmarked graves that dated to 1846. Here, I'm going to show you what was found in those graves. As you can see, the condition of these men who died in the 40s is remarkably preserved, and that's mostly due to the conditions in which they died and were buried. So people don't have to look. So among items recovered were logs and handwritten notes. In their logs, the crew remarked on encountering unfamiliar wildlife like the sea unicorn, which we know as the narwhal. I kind of like sea unicorn better. They remarked that they were trapped in a remote and desolate area that even the Inuit wouldn't visit. Extremely cold temperatures meant that crew had to be careful doing just about anything. Sweat could turn to ice and cause frostbite. Skin could get easily damaged outside. Hypothermia was always a concern. Scurvy and starvation set in for the survivors after abandoning ship, and most of them died on the march south. Logs indicated that Franklin passed in 1847, approximately a year before the ships were actually abandoned. One of the bodies in the 3 unmarked graves, you saw 2 of them there, actually indicated that crew had resorted to cannibalism, as one body showed evidence of knife marks. Another site showed more evidence of cannibalism, including human remains found in cooking pots. Many of the remains found showed signs of extreme lead poisoning, and it was found that the tins of food on board the ship were actually closed with lead solder. And that was a major factor in the demise of the crew itself. So in 2010, the wreck of the HMS Investigator was found. And that was actually one of the ships that was on a mission to find the Airbus and the Terror in 1850, and was abandoned 3 years later after getting stuck in ice. In 2014, searching south of the Victoria Strait, the wreck of the Airbus was discovered by Parks Canada in collaboration with the Inuit. Archaeologists brought up artifacts from the upper deck and part of the lower, including guns, part of the wheel, fittings from the ship, dinner plates, clothing, and personal items. You can actually see some of the plates in the bottom right corner there. In 2016, the HMS Terror was found lying on the seabed under approximately 157 feet of water in Terror Bay, far from the planned search area. The discovery was made when the Arctic Research Foundation ship made a detour to Terror Bay to follow up on a recollection made by one of the crew. To date, hundreds of artifacts have been recovered from the wrecks. And to see a Hollywood version of this story, there is a BBC show called Terror. It's streaming on Amazon, Hulu, AMC Plus, and it's actually a, pretty accurate version of the events that occurred on these ships. So next is the Queen Anne's Revenge, and it's a ship that is notorious mainly because of its captain. Queen Anne's Revenge was originally believed to have been built in 1710 for British merchant service and was named Concord. It was later captured by French privateers and named, very originally I might add, La Concorde, where it was mostly used as a slave trading ship. In 1717, the ship was captured by Edward Teach and his pirates in the West Indies. Now, Edward Teach doesn't sound like a very menacing pirate name, but his alter ego inspired fear and was the inspiration for the archetypal pirate in works of fiction. Edward Teach was better known as Blackbeard. His nickname was derived from his thick black beard and fearsome appearance. He was reported to have tied lit fuses under his hat to frighten his enemies. He was considered a shrewd and calculating leader who spurned violence, relying on his fearsome image. Having captured La Concorde, Blackbeard sailed it to Martinique, where he sold the slaves, added more heavy cannons, and made the newly named Queen Anne's Revenge his flagship. The year that Blackbeard had the ship, he captured numerous prizes and bounty, including vessels and cargo. He attacked many merchant ships between the West Indies and the Caribbean. Shortly after blockading Charleston Harbor in May of 1718 and refusing to accept the governor's offer of the king's pardon, Blackbeard ran Queen Anne's Revenge aground while entering Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, on June 10, 1718. The ship had a history of developing leaks, and some historians believe that Blackbeard believed the ship was not worth fixing and purposely ran it aground. Others believe he purposely ran it aground to disperse of his crew. He transferred supplies onto his smaller ship Adventure and abandoned crew members on nearby islands. Shortly afterward, he did accept the king's pardon for himself and his remaining crew, but once a pirate, always a pirate. He quickly returned to a life of piracy and was eventually killed in combat later on in 1718. 35 and 40 years of age. The wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered in 1996 in only 28 feet of water, and it has been added to the National Register of Historic Places. 31 cannons have been identified, and more than 300,000 artifacts have been recovered. The cannons are actually of different origins, including Sweden, possibly France, and of different sizes, as would be expected of a colonial pirate crew. So this is a ship at the entirely opposite end of the spectrum from the Queen Anne's Revenge. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was known as the Queen of the Great Lakes, and when launched in 1958 was the largest ship on the Great Lakes and remains the largest to have sunk there. The ship mainly hauled iron ore to several Great Lakes ports, setting seasonal haul records 6 times. One of the captains, Peter Pulser, was actually known as the DJ captain because he would pipe music day or night over the intercom while passing through the St. Clair and Detroit rivers. That, along with her size, endeared the SS Edmund Fitzgerald to boat watchers. On November 9th, 1975, en route to a steel mill near Detroit on Lake Superior, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, then captained by Ernest McSorley, along with a second freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, were caught in a severe storm with near hurricane-force winds and waves that reportedly reached 35 feet. Shortly after 7 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in 530 feet of water. The boat sent out one report of being in difficulty, but never sent out distress signals. The last message sent out from the captain at 7:10 p.m. was, quote, "We are holding our own," end quote. All 29 crew members, including the captain, were lost, and no bodies were ever recovered. It's believed that the ship suffered from a combination of being swamped, suffering structural failure, and shoaling, where waves in shallow water get taller, slow down, and get closer together. Wreck was discovered in 1975, just 5 days after it sunk, by a U.S. Navy aircraft equipped to detect magnetic anomalies usually associated with submarines. The area where the wreck was discovered, Whitefish Point, has claimed over 240 ships from 1816. The boat had split into 2 pieces with the bow upright in the mud. Between the 2 sections was a large mass of wreckage. And in 1976, the wreck was immortalized in the Gordon Lightfoot wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The number 6 is another well-known wreck on our list, the Rms Lusitania. And the Mauritania were commissioned by Cunard to compete with other transatlantic passenger companies like the aforementioned White Star Line. At the time of its completion in 1906, Lusitania was briefly the largest ship ever built, quickly eclipsed by the Mauritania, which was then, of course, eclipsed by the Titanic. At the time, both ships were said to have the most luxurious, spacious, and comfortable interiors, which included electric lighting and lifts and an early form of air conditioning. Passenger accommodations covered 6 decks, with each class being strictly segregated. According to her original configuration, she was designed to carry 2,198 passengers and 827 crew members. Cunard vessels were faster than the White Star Olympic class vessels, and that's the Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic, but the Olympic fleet was larger and allowed for more amenities. It was actually plagued with an insufficient number of lifeboats, actually carrying 4 fewer than the Titanic at the time of its launching. This was actually common practice because it was believed that in busy shipping lanes, help would always be nearby. After the Titanic sank, Lusitania and Mauritania were both equipped with additional boats. When World War I started, The Lusitania was requisitioned by the British Admiralty as an armed merchant cruiser, but was actually still allowed to be used for civilian passages, though not many people were taking trips. Warnings were printed, letting people know of the dangers of submarines. On May 7, 1915, bound for Liverpool from New York, Lusitania crossed in front of German U-boat U-20. A torpedo struck the starboard bow just beneath the wheelhouse. An explosion occurred shortly after, causing the boat to list starboard. Due to the list, many of the ship's lifeboats could not be launched. Only 6 of the 48 lifeboats were successfully launched. After being struck, the boat was completely underwater. Of those who missed being on board the Lusitania were Isadora Duncan, actor William Gillette, and William Morris, the talent agent who actually canceled his passage on the Titanic a few years earlier. In fact, several passengers had a connection to the Titanic, including Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, who missed boarding the Titanic, but unfortunately did not miss the Lusitania. Of the 1,962 passengers and crew, 1,198 lost their lives. 128 U.S. citizens were among those who died, and the sinking helped turn the tide of American views against the Germans. In 1935, the wreck was located 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland in roughly 305 feet of water. It lies on its starboard side. The wreck is badly collapsed on its starboard side due to the force with which it struck the bottom, coupled with the forces of winter tides and corrosion in the decades since the sinking. When contrasted with her contemporary Titanic, resting at a depth of 12,000 plus feet, appears in a much more deteriorated state due to the lying on the wreckage, the blasting of the wreck with depth charges, and multiple salvage operations. SS Andrea Doria was an ocean liner for the Italian line and was considered an icon of Italian national pride. Of all of Italy's ships at the time, Andrea Doria was the largest, fastest, and supposedly the ship first launched in 1951 with its maiden voyage. Equipped with a double hull, Andrea Doria was divided into 11 watertight compartments. Any 2 of these could be filled with water without endangering the ship's safety. Andrea Doria also carried enough lifeboats to accommodate all passengers and crew. Furthermore, the ship was equipped with the latest early warning radar. However, despite its technological advantages, the ship had serious flaws relating to its seaworthiness and safety. Confirming predictions derived from model testing during the design phase, the ship developed a huge list when hit by any significant force. It sailed the southern Atlantic routes. The Andrea Doria was the first ship to feature 3 outdoor swimming pools, 1 for each class, and when fully booked, the ship was capable of accommodating 1,241 passengers in the 3 different classes. On July 25, 1956, the Andrea Doria, traveling west through heavy fog, was struck on the side by the Swedish ship Stockholm off the coast of Nantucket. Stockholm was designed more for comfort than the luxury and opulence found on board Andrea Doria, because the Swedish-American line was aware that the age of transatlantic passenger travel was coming to an end with the rapid growth of air travel, and because Stockholm sailed close to the Arctic Ocean, it was designed with a strong ice-breaking bow, which turned out to be a major factor in her survival and the fatal damage to the Andrea Doria. The ice-breaking bow actually pierced the hull of the Andrea Doria to a depth of 40 feet. The 2 ships were aware of each other in the heavy fog, but using only radar made course corrections that actually brought them closer together rather than further apart. The Andrea Doria listed severely to one side, making loading of lifeboats difficult. However, unlike the Titanic, several nearby ships answered the SOS calls, including the Stockholm, which damage in the top center picture to the The ship fully went underwater about 10 hours after the collision. 46 passengers and crew were lost in the accident. The luxurious appointments and initially good condition of the wreck, with the top of the wreck lying initially in water, Andrea Doria has been a frequent target of treasure divers. It's commonly referred to as the Mount Everest of scuba diving, as a dive to this wreck can and should only be done by the most experienced technical divers. In fact, at least 22 divers have died trying to dive the wreck. The wreck lies approximately 70 feet below what is considered the suggested maximum depth for divers. A week after it went down, divers located the wreck. As of 2010, years of ocean submersion have taken their toll. The wreck has aged and deteriorated extensively, with the hull now fractured and collapsed. Upper decks have slowly slid off the wreck to the seabed below, and as a result of this transformation, a large debris field flows out from the hull of the liner. After years of removal of artifacts by divers, little of value is thought to remain. Significant artifacts recovered include the statue of Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria, for whom the ship was named. It was removed from the first-class lounge, having been cut off at his ankles to accomplish this. Ship's china have actually been considered valuable mementos of diving the wreck, and the ship's bell was considered the prize of the wreck. Back in time for the next few ships. The Mary Rose was a carrack, which is a 3 to 4 masted sailing ship of the English Tudor Navy of King Henry VIII, and is one of the earliest examples of a purpose-built sailing warship. The ship was launched in 1511. She was armed with new types of guns that could fire through the recently invented gun ports. In 1536, the ship was substantially rebuilt and last saw action in 1540. On July 19th of 1545, the Battle of Solent, the ship heeled heavily to the starboard side, and water rushed in through those exciting new gun ports that they put in. Most of the crew perished, approximately 365 souls, with only crewmen stationed at the tops of the mast guaranteed survival, as the ship was designed with anti-boarding nets, which inadvertently trapped fleeing crew members. Several days after the sinking, the first of many salvage attempts was ordered by the Tudor Navy, successful only in retrieving some items from the wreck. Though there are accounts of discovery over the years, the modern discovery of the wreck occurred in 1971. A trust was established to protect the wreck from looters and raise funds for protection, which included raising and preserving the remains of the hull. Excavation of the ship has given many insight into English shipbuilding techniques of that era. Remains of crew members recovered indicated that there was malnutrition and evidence of rickets, scurvy, and other deficiency diseases. The hull of the ship was finally raised from the water in October of 1982, and today it sits in the Mary Rose Museum in the UK. Over 26,000 artifacts and pieces of timber were raised. Items recovered included everything from clothing, games, personal hygiene objects, to tools by a master carpenter. Musical instruments, including fiddles and drums, were recovered, as well as barber's tools and navigation tools. The Vasa was a Swedish warship built between 1626 and 1628. This is not a recreation, this is the ship was richly decorated as a symbol of King Gustavus Adolphus's ambitions. On completion, Vasa was one of the most powerfully armed vessels in the world. However, Vasa was dangerously unstable, with too much weight in the upper structure of the hull. The ship was considered one of the most powerful warships of the time, and in fact, 588 pounds of shot could be fired from the cannons of one side. In comparison, the USS Constitution, a frigate built by the U.S. 169 years later after Vasa, had roughly the same firepower, but was over 1.5 million pounds heavier than Vasa. In August of 1628, Vasa was launched in Stockholm Harbor. Roughly 1,400 yards into her voyage, a strong gust of wind heeled the ship portside, allowing water to pour into the lower gun deck. The ship swiftly sank to a depth of 105 feet. Despite the many people present to watch the launching of the ship on shore, as well as the many boats in the water, 30 crew members still perished with the ship. Less than 3 days after the boat sank, a contract was signed for the ship to be raised, but efforts were unsuccessful. Almost all of the iron on the ship rusted away within a few years of the sinking. Wood-joined sections fared much better, including much of the decorative sculptures. In the 1950s, technology improved enough for the raising of the ship with a largely intact hull, where it now resides at the Vasa Museum in Stockholm. It's one of Sweden's most popular tourist attractions and is recognized as a symbol of the Swedish Empire. It's also an insight into naval warfare, shipbuilding techniques, and everyday life in early 17th century Sweden. So the Gribshunden was a Danish ship and the flagship of John, King of Denmark. The first known mention of the ship is from a letter dated May 16th, 1406, in which John, King of Denmark, mentions it. As the premier ship of the Danish fleet, Gribshunden was a symbol of military power intended to help deter the Swedes from independence, and John used it in 1495, as the flagship when entering negotiations with Sweden and Sten Sture of Sweden. While on the way to negotiations, while anchored in the Baltic Sea, the Gribshunden caught fire. John was not aboard the ship at the time of the fire, but many of the 150 crew members died in the fire and eventual sinking. This is known because of several written accounts dating from that time. John continued on after the loss of his flagship, but Sten Sture of Sweden actually did not turn up for the meeting. Years later in battle, Sten Sture was defeated by John. In the 1970s, the local diving club discovered the wreck in 33 feet of water. Unaware of the identity and significance of the wreck, archaeologists were not informed about this discovery until the year 2000. In 2013, the ship was identified as Gribshunden through techniques such as the dendrochronological sampling of the ship's timbers, which showed they came from felled in the winter of 1482 to 1483. Parts of the ship are in remarkably good condition, and it is among the best preserved ships from the late medieval period. That bottom left picture doesn't really show that, but they still consider it very well preserved. Among artifacts found are chainmail, crossbows, bones, barrels, glass, and capstans, which were the big wheels found on old ships that the crew used to haul ropes and cables. The ship remains loaded with artillery, including 11 iron cannons. In August of 2015, the ship attracted international media attention when a near perfectly preserved figurehead of a mythical beast was recovered and brought to the surface. A 2021 episode of Nova profiles the investigation of the Gribshunden. So the SS Thistle Gorham was a British cargo steamship built in 1940. Defensively equipped merchant ship with anti-aircraft guns. The ship made a few trips during World War II to bring supplies to different posts and was on its fourth voyage destined for Alexandria, Egypt, when disaster struck. The ship's cargo included Bedford trucks, armored vehicles, motorcycles, guns, ammunition, aircraft parts, railway wagons, and 2 steam engines of the cargo area. Most of the cargo was intended for Allied forces in Egypt. German intelligence located the ship in the Red Sea and dropped two 2.5-ton bombs on it. 9 members of the crew perished with the ship. Most of the cargo remained on the ship with the exception of the locomotives, which fell off the sides. In the early 1950s, Jacques Cousteau discovered the wreck with help from local fishermen. The wreck sits in about 100 feet of water. He raised several items, including a motorcycle, the captain's safe, and the ship's bell. The wreck site consistently attracts divers, both because of the amount of cargo that can be seen and explored, and because the bombs destroyed much of the midship structure, making it very accessible to divers. In addition to the ship itself, divers can also explore both steam locomotives, wreck. In the top left picture, you can see a dark shadow alongside the boat there, and that is one of the locomotives. Thistle Gorham is considered one of the top 10 diving sites in the world. The Gunilda was a steel-hulled Scottish-built steam yacht that was in service from 1897 to 1911. The ship became a flagship of the New York Yacht Club under the ownership of oil baron William L. Harkness. In August of 1911, Harkness took the boat filled with friends and family on an extended tour of Lake Superior. While heading to fish for speckled trout, the boat ran hard aground. Harkness stayed behind to supervise the salvage while his guests all departed the boat. After she was pulled free, she suddenly rolled over to starboard, filled with water, and sank within a few minutes. The wreck was rediscovered in 1967, resting in 270 feet of water, completely intact, with even the gilding on the hull surviving. Several attempts were made to salvage her, but all unsuccessful. Jacques Cousteau and his team did a dive to film the wreck, and Cousteau called the Gunilda wreck the most beautiful shipwreck in the world. Numerous artifacts, including a piano, which can be seen in the lower right image, several lanterns, and various pieces of furniture remain on board. And these pictures were taken as the items were found, so nobody picked anything up and moved it. That's actually how everything was found, just as is. The boat was actually named the second best technical diving spot in the world after the German battleship SMS Markgraf. Even with that title, 2 divers have perished diving the wreck of the Gunilda. This one was actually a late addition to my presentation, but I just kind of thought it was really cool. So the Santa Cristo de Burgos was a Manilla galleon, a type of sturdy wooden vessel that plied an annual trade route between the Spanish colonies in the Philippines and Mexico from 1565 to 1850, a period that marked the first era of global trade. These ships were considered workhorse European ships built in Asian ports by Asian craftspeople using. Despite their 250-year run and the inevitable loss of vessels crossing the hazardous Pacific, remarkably few Manila galleon shipwrecks have been found. In fact, only 3 are known from the west coast of the Americas, 1 each in Oregon, California, and Baja, Mexico. Santa Cristo de Burgos was built between 1687 and 1688 at the Spanish shipyard of Sorsogon on the island of Bogotá in the Philippines. The ship would have had a 1,000 to 1,500 ton towing capacity, which was fairly standard, and its cargo contained beeswax blocks with a distinctive owner's mark, Chinese porcelain from the Kangxi period, Chinese silk. The Santa Cristo de Burgos was en route to Acapulco, Mexico from the Philippines when it veered very far off course in 1693. Details of the wreck are unknown, but it is believed that the ship was weakened from inadequate repairs and got caught in the harsh winter weather off of the Oregon coast. That, in addition to the death of several crew due to scurvy, caused the demise of the ship. where the story gets more interesting. The ship is better known along the Oregon coast as the legendary Beeswax Wreck, a moniker derived from the blocks of beeswax that have washed ashore for centuries that were traded by the local Native American tribes and later Anglo-European settlers. Because honeybees are not native to the Americas, they were imported from Europe in the 17th century. Asian beeswax was a major import for Spain's colonies, where beeswax candles were required for Catholic services. Oral histories from the Native American tribes told tales of a foreign ship that wrecked long ago with a crew that came ashore and met varying fates. As white settlers came to the coast, Native American accounts became embroidered with increasingly fantastic tales of hidden riches. By the late 20th century, local legends of treasure and galleons and the hunt for them regularly appeared in Oregon newspapers. An all-volunteer archaeological group had begun searching for proof of the Native American legends without much success, other than beeswax and pieces of Chinese porcelain washing ashore. Pieces of wood were occasionally found caught between rocks as well. The local who located pieces of wood in the sea caves contacted the team to have the wood tested. Results revealed the timbers were hewn from a species of tropical hardwood found in Asia, and radiocarbon dating indicated the tree was felled around 1650, timing right to make this Santo Cristo de Burgos. Why did I include this ship on the list? Ikani Mountain, near Manzanita, Oregon, is called the Mountain of 1,000 Holes after more than a century of treasure seekers dug without success for the riches rumored to be hidden within its slopes. Stories of these shipwrecks and treasure play a prominent role in Oregonian coastal lore. This lore, along with the countless reports in Oregon newspapers and the Native American oral histories, caught the attention of a filmmaker we know by the name of Steven Spielberg, who wrote a beloved film called The Goonies, based on the ship. Researchers are actually still looking for the so-called smoking gun, such as a coin or any item that bears a date or name. So it may not be the booby-trapped treasure of One-Eyed Willie, but there might still be treasure to find in those caves. So the USS Indianapolis was launched in 1931 and was the flagship for the U.S. Navy's Scouting Force 1, a unit of the Navy designed to conduct reconnaissance in force to make way for the battle fleet. The ship then became the flagship for the 5th Fleet in battles across the Central Pacific in World War II. In July of 1945, the Indianapolis completed a top-secret high-speed trip to deliver parts of Little Boy, which was the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat, and the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, to the U.S. Air Force Base on the island of Tinian, and then departed for the Philippines for training duty. At 12:15 a.m. on July 30th, the ship was torpedoed by the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58 and sank in 12 minutes. The ship was top-heavy from additional armaments added for the war, and listed severely after being torpedoed, eventually rolling over completely. Her stern then rose into the air, and she sank. Of 1,195 crewmen aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 890 faced exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and shark attacks while stranded in the open ocean with few lifeboats and almost no food. Hundreds of sharks were drawn to the wreck by the noise of the explosions and blood in the water. After picking off dead and wounded, the sharks began attacking survivors. It is believed the shark attacks were made by oceanic white-tip sharks and tiger sharks, and you can see right some of the men in the water being surrounded. It is believed the shark attacks attributed to a number of deaths that range from a few dozen to 100. The Navy didn't learn of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis until 4 days later, when survivors were spotted by a bomber on routine patrol. Of the 890 crew members that were in the water, only 300. USS Indianapolis was repeatedly on a list of famous shipwrecks that have yet to be found and thought to be missing forever until just a few years ago. An expedition in 2017, funded by Microsoft founder Paul Allen, located the ship at a depth of 18,000 feet. The wreck is well preserved, albeit in pieces. I'd expect that most people are going to be very familiar with the next ship on our list as well. USS Arizona was a super dreadnought battleship built for the U.S. Navy in the 1910s. It was named in honor of the 48th state's recent. The ship made several overseas trips during its career, but was mostly known for being part of the Pacific Fleet. Largely used for training exercises and was even featured in a James Cagney film called Here Comes the Navy. In April 1940, she and the rest of the Pacific Fleet were transferred from California to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, as a deterrent to Japanese imperialism. On December 7, 1941, shortly before 8 a.m. local time, the Arizona was hit by Japanese torpedo bombers. After one of the bombs detonated in a magazine, she exploded violently and sank with a loss of 1,177 officers and crewmen. In total, after 2 hours of bombing, 21 U.S. ships were sunk or damaged, 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, and 2,403 people were killed. All of this happened while the U.S. and Japan were officially engaging in diplomatic negotiations for possible peace in Asia. From the outbreak of World War II on September 1, 1939 to December 8, 1941, the U.S. was officially neutral, as it was bound by the Neutrality Acts not to get involved in the conflicts raging in Europe and Asia. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, public opinion in the U.S. had not been unanimous. When polled in January of 1940, 60% of Americans were in favor of helping the United Kingdom in the war. Majority of Americans believed that the safety of the U.S. was contingent on the UK winning the war, and an even larger majority believed that the UK would lose the war if the U.S. stopped supplying war materials. Despite this, the same poll reported that 88% of Americans did not support entering the war. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of the 77th United States Congress, calling December 7th a Within an hour of Roosevelt's speech, Congress declared war on the Empire of Japan, and the attack on Pearl Harbor immediately united a divided nation. A poll taken between December 12th and 17th showed that 97% of respondents supported a declaration of war against Japan. On December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, and the U.S. reciprocated, formally entering the war in Europe. Having been unaware of Japanese plans, Hitler was initially furious that the U.S. had been dragged into the war at a time when he had not yet acquired full control of continental Europe. On the very day of the Pearl Harbor attack, Hitler himself had issued his Nacht und Nebel decree concerning the suppression of resistance activities within Nazi-occupied lands. Hitler, who had previously declared the Japanese honorary Aryans, claimed that this is what happens when your allies are not Anglo-Saxons. On December 7th, Churchill was at his country estate Chequers with a few friends and his family. Just after dinner, he was given news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He correctly surmised the consequences of the attack for the course of the entire war. And this is a quote. So we had won after all. We had won the war. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. How long the war would last or in what fashion it would end, no man could tell. Nor did I at this moment care, but now we should not be wiped out. Our history would not come to an end. We might not even have to die as individuals. Hitler's fate was sealed, Mussolini's fate. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. All the rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming. It's said that the greatest consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor was that the United States officially entered the war. The giant was woken up. Despite the perception of this attack as a devastating blow to America, only 3 ships were permanently lost to the U.S. Navy: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the Utah. Guns from the Arizona were salvaged and later installed on the USS Nevada, who fired them against the Japanese islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Today, the wreck still lies at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. It's considered a war grave. On their deaths, survivors of the attack could have had their ashes placed within the ship. Veterans who served on the ship prior to the attack could have their ashes scattered in the water surrounding the ship. The ship is actually managed by the National Park Service. The next couple of ships are going to be a bit more local for us, and we're going to start with one called the Bessie White. So the Bessie White was a Canadian coal schooner that went aground on Fire Island between 1919 and 1922. In the early morning, heavy fog caused the schooner to run aground, and the vessel quickly filled with water. The top left picture is actually an image of their ship. They launched 2 boats, waiting for daybreak, and made their way ashore. The cargo of coal was a complete loss, but all of the crew survived. In the following weeks, much of the ship was salvaged before the wreck washed out to sea. What makes this wreck interesting for Fire Island lore is that a large part of the hull of the ship can be found within the Otis Pike Fire Island High Dunes wilderness. This expanse of wood and nail was unearthed and became completely visible in 2012 due to Hurricane Sandy. As wind and waves shape the beach, the ship's skeleton is covered and uncovered, and it should be noted that it has never been definitively proven that this is the Bessie White, though it is highly likely. Next 2 ships, I got help on the information from one of our former archivists, Mayra Scanlon, who provided the images and the information. John Milton was presumably named for the English poet and polemicist John Milton, famous for his work Paradise Lost. The ship's construction was completed in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in 1854 with a cost of $100,000. Primary owner of the ship was a wealthy businessman and banker, Edward Mott Robinson from Philadelphia. It first launched from New Bedford in October of 1854 with a rather large audience at the docks. It traveled immensely over the course of several years from the East Coast to the West Coast, including the Chincha Islands crew. The ship left Hampton Roads, Virginia for New Bedford on February 16, 1858, of Captain Ephraim Harding. The ship's log records severe winds and snowstorms during their journey up the coast to New York. On February 20th, 1858, the John Milton wrecked during extreme weather off the shore of Ditch Plains, Montauk. John Milton's captain, Ephraim Harding, was welcomed by the lights of the Fire Island Lighthouse and assumed that the next light signal would be the Montauk Lighthouse. Unknown by him, the Ponquag or Shinnecock Lighthouse had just been activated on January 1st, 1858. The lighthouse helped fill the 67-mile void between Fire Island and Montauk, but unfortunately confused many mariners early on. Seeing this light signal is assumed to have confused Captain Harding and the crew in thinking they had reached Montauk, causing them to shift direction. This is said to have, in combination with low visibility due to the snowstorm, caused the John Milton to run along the rocky shore of Montauk and wreck. The wreck was spotted during the day by local Samuel Stratton and Captain Thomas Jefferson Mulford. By nightfall, many deceased crewmen washed ashore and were recovered. Mulford was able to recover the ship's logbook from the chest pocket of a seaman. A total of 24 bodies out of the assumed 34 to 35 aboard washed ashore over the next few days and were recovered, including Captain Harding. A Funeral service was held for the deceased crewman of the John Milton on February of 1858. A monument was erected in the South End Burying Ground near Town Pond in East Hampton to mark the final burial site of at least 24 of the lives lost in the wreck. Some interesting facts. The bell recovered from the wreck of the John Milton hung in the session house of East Hampton Presbyterian Church for almost 150 years. Captain Harding's 15-year-old son, Rodolphus, actually also perished in the wreck of the John Milton, but his body actually was never recovered. Circassian, a large cargo ship, ran aground along the shore of Bridgehampton, Long Island, near Mecox Bay during extreme winter weather. The Circassian schematics were equal to 1,741 tons, 280 feet long, and 39 feet wide. Originally built in Ireland in 1856, it featured double steam engines and varied in services. She first served as a passenger and cargo ship in the Irish Sea, but at the outbreak of the American Civil War, was converted into a Confederate blockade runner. She was captured by Federal Navy forces and served as the USS Circassian for transporting supplies and possibly troops along the Atlantic coast. After the war, she was sold, made her way back home to Great Britain, where her new owners converted her to a fully sailing vessel. The ship left from Liverpool, England on November 6, 1860. Carrying 1,400 tons of heavy cargo, including 41,000 bath bricks, 600 tons of caustic soda, 280 barrels of soda crystals, 87 casks of bleaching powder, 281 bags of hide pieces, 100 cases of sauce. They don't tell us what type of sauce, but sauce, and much more. As she made her way along the dangerous shores of Long Island under the extreme winter storm weather, she struck the sandbar and ran aground. Flares of distress were sent off in hopes to seek the help of any life-saving station on the shore able to assist. Samuel H. Howell of the Mecox Life-Saving Station was patrolling the shore the night of December 11, 1876, and saw the distress of the Circassian and sent off the response flares to tell the crew that help was on the way. Men were sent to warn and gather help from nearby life-saving stations at Georgia and Southampton. Remaining station keeper and 4 crewmen began work to bring equipment to the beach and prepare for the rescue as soon as daylight. Those on the Circassian, not yet in dangerous peril, but taking much abuse from the storm, stayed with the ship and waited out the night. After waiting for the tide, better light, and calmer seas, the crew of the life-saving station finally reached the ship's side and aided in rescuing all crew and passengers, totaling 49 men, 36 seamen from the Circassian, the pilot, and 12 seamen from the Heath Park ship that was a ship that the Circassian actually aided along the way. Captain Richard Williams insisted on going back to the ship to remove cargo, but many of his men refused. Williams and Captain John Lewis with the Coast Wrecking Company, with several of his men, started the work of removing cargo and possibly freeing the Circassian. They sought the Shinnecock Reservation for help in the recovery, as many members of the tribe were well-known whalers and experienced. With another storm underway, on top of already threatened weather, Lewis was determined to finish the removal of the cargo, but rough seas delayed much of the work. He refused lifelines to the shore, and many of the men aboard aiding in the recovery struggled to withstand the conditions. On December 27th, the last communication between the Circassian and the shore, 32 men were still aboard the ship: Captain Lewis and Williams, 4 engineers, 10 members of the Shinnecock tribe, 1 Southampton man, and 15 remaining. The pending storm had arrived, and conditions worsened to the point that any form of rescue was deemed impossible. On the night of December 30th, the ship broke apart into 2 halves and slowly sank. A lantern patrol was organized in hopes to spot any sightings of survivors along the beach or surf. 4 men clinging to a buoy were rescued about half a mile down the shore. Those who survived were a first mate, a second mate, a member of the wrecking company, and the ship's carpenter. 10 Shinnecock tribe members were lost. Captain Lewis and the 3 engineers were taken to New York City for burial, and the remaining 14 workers who perished in the sinking were buried in the Old South End burying ground in East Hampton, near Town Pond. So these are a list of famous ships that haven't been located yet. So if there's any treasure hunters out there that want to take a stab, it could be fun. The flagship of Christopher Columbus, the Santa Maria, and the story goes that on Christmas Eve of 1492, Columbus went to sleep and left a cabin boy in charge of steering the ship. The ship ran aground somewhere near present-day Haiti, and Columbus deemed the ship beyond repair and abandoned it. HMS Endeavour gained notoriety as the ship Captain Cook used during his first voyage of discovery. However, the ship did not go down because of unforeseen circumstances like battle or weather. The British deliberately sunk the ship in Narragansett Bay to serve as a blockade against the French during the American Revolution. It was a French sailing ship and the largest vessel to cross the Great Lakes in 1679. It landed on an island on Lake Michigan to trade with local Native Americans. After leaving the port, it was caught in an intense storm and never seen again, and it's considered the white whale of Great Lakes shipwrecks. Merchant Royal is an English merchant ship that traded between England and the Spanish colonies in the West Indies. It sprung a leak on its way back to London, carrying 100,000 pounds of gold and many other valuables off the coast of Cornwall County, England. In 2019, the anchor was located, but the rest of the wreck remains lost. The gold alone is estimated to be worth $1.5 billion. The Wasp. The sloop was the 5th ship named the Wasp in U.S. naval history and was dedicated to taking down British ships during the War of 1812. But in October of 1814, without a trace on its way to the Caribbean, taking all 173 crew members with it. Flor de la Mar was a 16th century Portuguese sailing ship that had an impressive career, making numerous trips through the Indian Ocean, but had a history of springing leaks and needing repairs. The Flower of the Sea was caught in a storm off the coast of Sumatra. While the captain and some crew did survive the ship, the rest remain lost, along with the estimated $2.6 billion in treasure it holds. SS Waratah, which is nicknamed Australia's Titanic, was a 500-foot steamship that vanished in July 1909 as it was making its way from Durban, South Africa to Cape Town, carrying 211 passengers and crew. The final sighting was believed to have occurred on July 28, 1909, during a violent storm. Nothing more was heard from the ship again. The Bonham Richard was a Continental Navy ship, served the American Patriot cause well, reportedly capturing 16 British merchant ships. In the first weeks, it was put to use under Captain John Paul Jones. In September of 1779, the ship was hammered by a better armed British ship. Despite Jones' perseverance, and he allegedly said, "Sir, I have not yet begun to fight," the ship sank. Las Cinco Chagas in 1594, this Portuguese carrack was nearing the end of a long trip from India to Portugal, carrying more than 1,100 people. As it approached Portugal, the Chagas was attacked by British privateer ships and bombarded nonstop for 2 days. Finally, it caught fire and sank. According to reports, the Chagas was carrying 22 chests of treasure, including diamonds, rubies, and pearls, and estimated today to be worth about $1 billion. And the USS Cyclops, this U.S. Navy ship was one of the more famous victims of the notorious Bermuda Triangle. On its way to Baltimore after leaving Rio de Janeiro, the ship disappeared. Little was known about what could have caused the disappearance, but it was believed to have been overloaded with 11,000 tons of manganese, as well as some theorize it may have either been a German submarine that sunk it or a drunk captain. Very different stories there. There's some interesting facts and honorable mentions. The USS Johnston, the World War II destroyer, is the deepest shipwreck discovered and approximately 21,180 feet of water. The Nuestra Senora de Atocha contains the largest treasure ever found in a shipwreck at an estimated $400 million, and that's a shipwreck that was found with treasure. The others haven't been found yet. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the shipwreck with the greatest loss of life during wartime, with approximately 9,000 people perishing. The Doña Paz is the deadliest peacetime shipwreck, a passenger ferry in the Philippines. It collided with an oil freighter, killing an estimated 4,000 people on board. Where are the most shipwrecks found? The coast. It's believed that there are approximately 430 abandoned or ghost ships in our oceans at any given time. So before you decide to go deep sea diving, here are some things to consider. There is lots and lots of treasure left to discover if you have the time, the skill, the financial backing, the equipment, the luck to find it. Greg Stem, who is co-founder of the Odyssey Marine Exploration, said in a 2007 interview with Fortune magazine that there's billions of dollars scattered on the ocean floor. That's a fact. And we have the technology to find it. But just because you have the know-how doesn't mean it's easy to do. The business model is very simple. The execution is complex. So if you find a shipwreck, can you keep your discovery? That's a difficult question to answer. Technically, seas and oceans are governed by the UN laws of the sea, and ownership of sunken property found in international waters are governed by the law of salvage and the law of fines. But particularly since the booty is of mixed heritage, for example, country A might have plundered country B and then sunk their ship off the coast of country C. Sorting out the issues of ownership and profitability are anything but simple. In fact, there is often so much litigation that goes on with regard to any valuable discovery. It sometimes seems like some of these wrecks will be tied up in court about as long as they have been missing in the first place. So for whether or not you plan to suit up and go diving for wrecks, there's lots of resources out there for shipwreck hobbyists, museums. There are a few that you might want to check out: Ikani Magazine, the National Park Service, the Florida Keys National Maritime Sanctuary, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, and Lost Treasures of the Seven Seas. And however you plan to search, whether it be on the internet, by book, or physically getting into a boat, there's so much to learn from what sits under the sea. Happy hunting, everybody.